Welcome to Season 5, Episode 8 of Fire Away, Rudner Law's online show focused on the employment law issues that matter to you. My name is Stuart Rudner. I'm an employment lawyer and mediator and the founder of Rudner Law and your host of this episode of Fire Away. I want to remind everyone that Fire Away streams live online every month. If you missed an episode or you want to watch one again, they're always available on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, and our website. Today, I am very excited to be joined by Christine Miles. Christine is the CEO and founder of EQuipt. She has written a book called What Is It Costing You Not to Listen, which discusses why listening is the most important and the most powerful communication skill we have, and how maximizing our listening skills enables us to be amazing communicators and strong leaders. Obviously, this is crucial in the workplace and the HR world, and the failure to listen effectively, frankly, is one of the reasons why our firm is as busy as we are. So I'm looking forward to getting into this discussion. Christine, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
I think this should be a great discussion. So I'll start off by asking you this. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, the pandemic had a lot to do with the timing of me writing the book. This is work I've been doing my entire life. I learned to listen differently from a very young age. I was 5. I grew up with a mother who had some mental illness, and my job was to understand what went along, below the surface. And that had a big impact on me, and I learned to listen differently, and that was been a thread to my success in my life and part of what I've been doing with organizations. But as much as people know how important listening is, it's really hard to get them to want to put time on task and pay attention to it. I think the pandemic shifted things, and I saw that opportunity, and I thought now it's time to really get the word out in a broader way and create what I call like a movement where we start to really, really change the paradigm of what we're doing to communicate, in large part for what you said. We're creating a lot of problems, and it solves a lot of problems.
And so for those who haven't read the book, I mean, what are the key points? What should people understand about how they should be listening?
Well, I think you can't solve a problem you don't know you have. So that's part of why I titled the book what I did. What is it costing you not to listen? Because we go to solutions very fast in a lot of ways, but I don't know that people even know that they're not listening. We did a workshop yesterday with a client, and it was the second day. And one of the gentlemen said, I didn't realize how much I've missed in the last 20 years. He had seen his college roommate, and he said, I missed out on so much because I didn't know I wasn't listening. And so first you have to realize that and understand what listening is, because we're told to listen but not taught. There's 0 years of education on listening in our educational systems. So we're woefully underqualified to be good at it, to know what it's supposed to look like. And so the first thing is tapping into that, and then we can help you tap into the solution. So the book is both understanding the problem and then how to fix it.
Well, I love what you said about, we're solving problems that we don't even know we had. And I think lawyers are really bad at just jumping to conclusions. And I think that was one of the points in your book, is that we often, we jump to conclusions without properly listening. And one of the terms that I often hear is active listening. But I know when we spoke briefly that this is different than that. So how is this different than what people talk about when they talk about active listening?
Well, I think those are two parts, two different things you said that marry together. So it's good to hear lawyers are guilty of this, because we're all guilty of problem solving, and in large part because we want to be helpful. I think whether that's in our personal lives or our business lives, lawyers are there to help the client solve the problem. So we tend to want to do that in life, and that leads us down a road sometimes that costs us because we spend time solving things that aren't the real problem. Or maybe we go in too zealously. And the more knowledge and experience we have, the less likely we are to listen well, because we've seen the movie before. So we jump in and we jump to conclusions. So one of the problems, and to go to point 2, which is active listening, It's important that we pay attention to people, and active listening has been the gold standard, but I think it's kind of, well, again, very underachieving, because I can show you that I'm listening by paying attention, but is that really enough? And it tells you what to do, but not how to do it. So the way we teach people how to listen is to transform entirely how they listen, and that is to listen to understand before they start to solve. So when we understand, then we understand the problem, we get to the root cause, we get to the meaning, and then we can solve problems in a different way, again, personally and professionally.
Yeah, and look, obviously this has a lot of application to the HR world. And I know when we first started talking, I was focused on job interviews.
Mm-hmm.
But then when we were talking some more, I realized this applies to job interviews, performance reviews, requests for accommodation. And there's so many different scenarios in the employment or HR world where people are having conversations, but not really listening, jumping, as you said, jumping to conclusions, solving problems that may not really exist. Um, so I want to come back to that, but you made me think of something when you were talking about how you started or you did the book during the pandemic, because obviously a whole lot of our world has moved online, and
Yes.
one of the big debates in the legal world was the efficiency or efficacy of online hearings, and can you really have a
Mm.
mediation by Zoom, which I wholeheartedly think you can, but can you have, examinations for discovery, or what you guys in the States call depositions? Can you have a trial by Zoom? So I was curious if that relates to anything that you talk about in your book or in your practice. Is it different listening when you're not in the same room?
I think it's even more important that you do it well, because you don't have the feelings that you get when you're in the room, right? And that's pro and con, because sometimes that neutralizes some things because we have biases and so forth. But I think virtual environments absolutely work. I think managing the virtual environment is part of the issue. And listening in the virtual environment is more challenging for people because they have less of the cues. So this is why being prepared and having the tools are so important, where you can miss a lot, as well as the multitasking that happens that we can't control. There's a mirroring process that happens in those environments that we're unaware of, that if I'm doing something else while we're talking, it's going to impact you, whether you're doing it or not, just by virtue that I am. So there's a
Right.
lot of complications there. But listening differently and listening in a different way beyond active listening will help you be much better in that environment. And I think it's important.
Right. Yeah, thanks. I think that makes sense. And like I said, I'm a big believer in use of video and Zoom, especially in mediations, which I do a lot of, and they're in many ways even more effective than being in person for reasons that I'll save for another episode. But you mentioned bias in your comments. I know that was one of the big points that you talk about in the book as well. So maybe you can talk about bias and how you address it or control the biases that we all have.
Well, so yeah, we all have them, right? The brain sorts just for safety. So even if you think you're clear of biases, forget it. You're not, because it's just human. The brain works that way. It also is what makes the enemy of listening is the brain, because it's a superpower, and most of it's in the subconscious that we're not aware of. So the definition of emotional intelligence is really putting language around things that we're doing, right? And knowing that we're doing it. And part of understanding bias is knowing what your biases are. So when you listen to yourself as well as listen to others, so you first have to know the story you're telling yourself, and then you have to find out the story that others are telling. And when you find those two things, you're in a different paradigm and a different conversation. This is an important part of work around diversity and understanding diversity and how to have the conversations. Part of what I wrote about in the book is a large study was done, and they came up with 5 things that are important to do. And the first one is, guess what? Listen, except we spend no time teaching people how to do it. So we think having the conversations about talking, but it's really about how we understand different perspectives and point of view more than what we're saying.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us, and I know I'm guilty of this as well, is we're not necessarily listening because while the other person is talking, we're already preparing what we're going to say next. And this is a perfect example of it. While you're talking, I am listening to you, but nobody wants to see me sitting here not saying anything for 30 seconds while I process my next question. So
Yeah.
I'm already thinking ahead. And of course, as soon as you
Sure.
start thinking, you're not listening. So That's one point that I've taken out of our conversation so far, is to start planning less and listening more.
Well, it's true. You
Sorry, go
have
ahead.
some pressure. You have some pressure on you in this scenario, so that's very real. But mind reading is one of the top listening inhibitors, or pardon me, rehearsing is one of the top inhibitors that people have in meetings, in conversations. I need to prepare what I'm going to say. I'm processing that without the pressure of doing an interview. So it's human, because that's where our minds are going. So we need to soothe the brain in such a way that we let that off the hook. And that's why when you have the tools, and what I talk about in the book is really the path to understanding, we call it the listening path, which provide you the tools that allow you the tools to do the work. I can build a house, but I should have a hammer, I should have a wrench, I should have a saw, I should have some things. Otherwise, to just do it with my hands is going to be a lot harder. So
Right.
same with listening, we need to have the tools so that we can overcome the obstacles like that.
And so what, other than the stuff you've mentioned, what other tools do you think people need?
Well, I'm going to try to help solve your problem, if that helps you, since you were so open to say, hey, I'm thinking about my next question. One of the things about listening is that questions can actually interfere with listening rather than help it in conversation. And please don't take this the wrong way, but we actually describe the defense attorney in the book, or I do, as well as the curious detective, because the defense attorney is supposed to shape the story that they get from the witness to prove their case, right? You can do that in an argumentative way, or you can do that in a very collaborative way, but you have a job to get that out of your client, your witness. In conversations, that's not really how it works. You want to open it up and let the story come to you. And so that's why we call it the curious detective. So one of the tools on what we call the listening path is the compass. It's very easy to get lost on the path to understanding. And so when you have the powerful tool, the compass, which are what we call the 6 most powerful questions that you can ever ask. These are questions that journalists ask and therapists ask, and they're pretty simple in nature, but they anchor you to understand and get more of the story. And one of those is simply, tell me more. That's one of the questions. Take me back to the beginning. How does that make you feel? These are just a few of those 6 questions.
That's really helpful and really interesting. I'm curious. I don't know why my mind went to this, but a lot of times when we're working with a client, especially the first meeting where they're really, it's the first time for us to understand what has happened. And I'm always careful, or I don't like to interrupt them too much. I like to let them to give me the story, and then I'll go back and I'll ask questions and get more detail. But every now and then, I don't follow the story because there's been a jump, or there's been some assumption there that I'm not aware of. So I guess my question for you, and it's I'm not sure if you can answer it or not really, it's in that context where you're just sort of trying to get as much information as you can. Is it better to interrupt and ask more detailed questions in the middle, or wait until the end?
So it's a yes, no. So interrupting.
You sound like a lawyer now.
It's yes, you should interrupt, but it's how you interrupt. That's part of the how you do it. Asking detailed questions are not necessarily what's going to get you more of the story. So that's the no part. So the other thing that's important as a tool, and the metaphor that I talk about in the book, is you wouldn't go hiking in the woods, and it's for 3 weeks camping with, again, no tools or supplies. You wouldn't get from one side of the mountain to the other safely. The same is true when you're meeting with a client or having a conversation. I need to get the story. So you need the map. You need to know where you're going. Most people start the story in the middle. It's like watching a movie. If you started in the middle of the movie, you're confused, you're disoriented, you're not sure where you are. We don't know where somebody is in the story. Did they start at the beginning? Or are they at the end? Where are they? And that's part of why it's hard to anchor where we are. When we have the map, we know where we are. We know how to get more details. So one of the most powerful questions you can ask is, can you take me back to the beginning? Can you tell me where this started? That takes people to the beginning of the movie, and then you go from there. And then you're more oriented where you are with them. And you'll find out with your clients, that's a perfect way to start the problem-solving process, because people start at the middle, not at the beginning most often.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So since most people don't listen properly, what can we do as when we're speaking to someone to make sure that they're listening properly and getting the whole story?
Well, I think, yeah. So, how do I know I'm understood? How do they know they've heard me? Because statistically, it's pretty bad. We only retain 17 to 25% of what we hear. And we're only listening, most people, to 25% of their capacity. We're not good at this, okay? Only 10% of people listen well. That's abysmal. And again, it's because we're not taught, we're told. So one thing you can do is simply ask people to reflect back what they heard, summarize it. If you want to see, hey, why don't you share with me what you took away from that at a high level? Provide that back to me. And then that's an alignment tool. And this is very important in HR, very, very important, because we think because we said something, that means they understood. That's not necessarily the case. So if you want to make sure you're clear and aligned, ask somebody to say, what did you take away from that? What did you hear?
So I can see how that would definitely be awkward, though, and especially I'm thinking in the HR context. If you're talking to your manager, let's say you're asking for some sort of accommodation, or you're just asking for help, especially if you're talking in someone who's in a position of power, I can see how that would be awkward because it's almost challenging them, or it's almost testing them in a way. So how do you do that without coming across as testing them?
Well, a couple things. Again, we're talking in the middle of the movie, so it's all how you frame and message it, right? It's like, I want to make sure that I've done my job to really help you, that I've supported you, so let's make sure we're aligned. Like, that's one thing. It's how you say it. Again, yesterday doing this workshop, that very point came up, and somebody told a story of how they have an intern who just comes when he gives her a task or an assignment. She reflects back to him all the things she's supposed to do, when it's due, all this. She's an intern. And he said, that's really helpful. And I said, now you can actually ask for that. And you can make that a normal way of communicating and processing. When you have a common language for listening, it's not off-putting. So culturally, it's about shifting how people see it. It's not a challenge, it's an alignment. So, but you do need to help socialize that. One of the problems we have is we don't have a language around listening in our cultures and our organizations. So this is part of our mission, is to create that culture of listening and a common language, because it doesn't exist.
So one of the contexts I was thinking of this entire concept, and it was performance reviews, which can be very difficult and very emotional. And I've certainly met with a lot of people over the years who were, distraught after their performance review. So, and what I was thinking is sometimes I've had people come into our office and what we found out later is they didn't get the message because they were so upset they weren't listening. So I guess what I was wondering about is, do you have any tips for people when they realize that they're in the middle of a conversation, they're getting upset, they may not be listening properly? Like, how do you sort of recenter yourself so that you start listening properly again?
I think that's the job of the manager or the one providing the performance review. All right. So while employees can take some control over that, and I think, again, we don't socialize or teach people how to handle the emotional aspect of the conversation. We teach them only how to handle the knowledge part, the nuts and bolts, the blocking and tackling. And it's really the need to do both. I just had a conversation this morning with a client, a director of HR of a large company, and she said, this is what we need help with. Again, we're starting in the middle of the movie if we expect managers to go in and be able to handle the emotional stuff in addition to the nuts and bolts. Back in the day, I did a lot of performance review training. I did a lot of management training. And the number one fear of men, and I'll stereotype, were that the woman was going to cry. And the number one fear of women was that the man was going to get angry. So those are gender specific and maybe outdated, but nevertheless, the emotions are what scare people. So we have to equip them with how to handle the emotional aspect of the story. And that's a big part of listening to understand, not agreeing. We're not here to agree. We're here to understand your emotions. That actually, when you meet the emotional language, you actually make it a more logical conversation. It's not the other way around.
Yeah, I think that's it's a really interesting point about the gender differences, but it's also a really important point because sometimes people do get emotional.
Sure.
And I think they're really turned off when the other person just ignores it. And so there's nothing wrong with acknowledging it without, as you said, without agreeing. But I think that's a really important point as well. I want to flip this back a bit to the interviews because I've worked with HR for 23 years now, and I've heard all the stories about how badly interviews are done and how people aren't asking the right questions or aren't listening to the answers and really are not, they're not helping organizations to choose the best people because of the way the interviews are done. So I wanted to ask if you had specific tips both for the people doing the interviews, but also the interviewee, the applicant for the job, and any tips you have for them.
Well, we know that the best practice for interviews is to really get behavioral anecdotes or stories, right? That's what behavioral interviewing is about. The best predictor of past behavior is future behavior, and the more recent, the more predictive. So when we look at behavioral interviewing, situation, task, action, result, I hear story. We're getting stories. So again, you need to know the map in order to know what am I missing, what am I hearing, and then how to dig deeper, both from an interviewee perspective and an interviewer. At a 17 to 25% retention rate, because we're not taught, we don't have the tools, we're taking away these little glimpses rather than the highlights. And that's in part because of our own biases. So when we're not trained to listen differently, we are going to objectify with our own biases that the candidates, and we're not necessarily going to bring out the best in them because we don't know how to probe and really get more out of them. Some people are nervous in an interview situation. Some people don't present well. That doesn't mean they're not a great employee. You can get razzle-dazzled by an employee and then not be in an interview and they may not be great, or the other way around. So it's really how to really find what's not said and to bring more out in the candidate. And I think those kinds of that exchange is important on both sides of the equation.
So you made me think of something as you were talking. So what about if well, I mean, I was thinking interview, but it applies to any conversation. When you're in a conversation and you realize the other person is just clearly not paying attention. And I was actually flashing back to a summer job interview after my second year of law school. So we're now going back 25 years. But I'll never forget that the guy was just, busy shuffling papers, looking through files and doing everything but listening to me as I was talking. It was very clear that he was not paying attention. So what do you do if you're in that situation?
If I were in that, I would stop talking. I would really.
I didn't have the nerve to do that as a law student.
Well, it shows the power of it that you remember that, because I think interviews need to be challenging. You need to treat them like customers because your reputation's at stake. No matter, even if the candidate walks in and they're not right, they're still going to go out and talk about your company later. So you better create a great experience. That's the first thing. And just by him not paying attention, that really stuck with you. So that's just one of the things I think we feel we need to do is fill the space. So sometimes silence and just pausing it's discombobulating and people will attend in. So I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. I just might be like, slow down, I'm going to pause, wait till he stops, because he would, most likely, and then continue to answer. So we don't need to fill the silence all the time, but it's hard. Again, you need the tools to know how to do that, because otherwise you're just white knuckling it and you won't have the nerve.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, you make a great point about silence, and silence can be a great tool in a conversation to get people to talk. Or your example is a great one, because even if someone is sort of listening to you in the background while they do something else, they'll realize that the sound stopped and you're not talking anymore. And
that's right. That's right. Yep.
So yep. That's a great point. I have to tell you, by the way, in the pre-show we were talking about the old TV shows. As you're talking, I keep thinking every time you say the word listening, I'm thinking of Fraser Crane. I feel like I should be doing my best Fraser Crane now. And so let me get this right. It's like, hello, Christine. I'm listening. I think that's how we just start every phone call. Although I don't think we listened very well after that. But
probably not.
But no, I mean, I think it's a really important point, and everything you said is really important for so many aspects of HR. And as I said at the beginning, if people listened, our firm would be a lot less busy. So perhaps I shouldn't be encouraging this as much as I am, but nevertheless, we'll find other things to do with our time. And speaking of time, this as always, this has flown by. So before I I wrap things up. Do you have any other
can I
final
just say
thought?
one quick
No,
thing before?
no, I was going to
And
give you a chance to give us some
oh,
final thoughts, please.
yeah, here's my final thought. And the more, and writing the book even more so made this clear to me, which is the more I focus on the problem of not listening, the more I realize listening differently solves most problems, or at least gets you on the path to solving the problem. So it's not all the solution necessarily, but it is a huge, huge part of it. And so I think we can overcomplicate things, and this it's simple, not easy. But when you enable people and you give them a common language, you would be amazed how many things get resolved on their own because of that ability. So again, that's the mission we're on, is really to change the paradigm.
Thank you for that. And exactly as we've been saying, and so much of our time in our firm is spent dealing with issues that should never have been issues. It's just because there was never a clear communication, largely because somebody wasn't listening. So, thank you for that, and thanks for joining me on the show today. It was great to have your insights.
Thank you so much. I appreciate being here.
That was great. And now I get my turn to fire away. So the point I wanted to make this month is very simple. DIY does not work when it comes to HR. So I know that DIY has become very common things in many aspects of life. I just want to emphasize that HR should not be one of them. And there's a really big difference between me deciding to mount a shelving unit in my bedroom, although people who know me well would say that's a really bad idea. But there's a big difference between that and the average person drafting an employment agreement or coming up with their own legal opinion of the severance package they've been offered. And those are really two of the most common examples I can come up with. We see employment contracts in our firm every single day that are literally not worth the paper they're printed on. And as I think regular viewers will know, the most important part of the contract is usually the termination clause, which establishes how much notice or severance someone will get. And the reason employers want to use them is because it can limit the severance costs. And as a result, because it can limit someone's entitlement when they lose their job, courts are very, very circumspect when they review these clauses, and they're the most susceptible to challenge. And yet, we have many employers who adopt the DIY approach. They do it themselves. Perhaps they use something they found online, or they use the last contract they signed back when they were an employee. And more often than not, the clause or the contract as a whole is worthless. And at the end of the day, they may have saved $1,000 or so by not getting a lawyer to draft a contract. They can end up spending an extra tens of thousands of dollars. Imagine thinking that you only have to give someone 8 weeks of termination pay and finding out that because your clause was not properly drafted, you're on the hook for 10 months. And we see this all the time. Or we see employers who just assume that they know the law, they'll do it themselves, they can assess the situation and determine that they had cause to fire an employee, or that the severance entitlement is minimal. So they prepare the documents, they don't bother to see an HR lawyer, and then they realize that the documents were faulty and they get sued. And this, I can't even tell you the number of times over my career where I've spoken with an employer, talked to them about determinations, talked to them about our process for providing an opinion, giving them advice, determining how they're going to proceed. They decided to go and do it themselves. And then they call me back a month or two later when they're being threatened with a wrongful dismissal claim. And of course, it costs them many, many times what it would have cost them just to do it right the first time. From the employee perspective, it's amazing how many people get their employment agreements or their job offers or their severance offers, and they take the DIY approach and they do some Google research and they talk to their friends, and they often don't realize for years how big a mistake they made. And then the contract is the best example. We often see people who come into our office or come into our office virtually these days, and they've got a severance package and they can't figure out why it's so small. And we have to explain to them that the reason that they are not entitled anymore is because of the contract they signed 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, which dramatically limited their entitlement. And now you can just see the shattered look on their face when they realize that they saved a few $100s many years ago, and now they've cost themselves thousands or tens of thousands of dollars. And ironically, we often see what I call the battle of the DIY, which is where the employee agreed to a contract, doing it themselves without getting legal advice, and it would have dramatically reduced their entitlement. But the employer also took a DIY approach, drafted themselves, and because of that, it's not even enforceable. But of course, even in that situation, the employer thinks they have a valid contract. The employee says they don't. They're both retaining lawyers. They're both spending a whole lot of money on legal fees. to fix a problem that wouldn't have existed if they didn't take a DIY approach from the start. So there is an old saying about being penny wise and pound foolish, and there is definitely some truth to it. You might save some money in the short term by not getting proper legal advice, but you tend to lose a lot more in the long run. So bottom line for this discussion, HR and DIY don't work together. So that's all for today. That's all the time that we have for season 5, episode 8 of Fire Away. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in. I want to have a big thank you to Christine for joining me today and having a great discussion on why we're not listening as well as we should be. I want to remind everyone that at Rudner Law, we want people to treat their employment relationships as legal relationships and make informed decisions rather than assumptions. Don't take the DIY approach. I invite everyone to keep up to date on employment law issues by following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, by liking our Facebook page, subscribing to our YouTube channel, and subscribing to our newsletter. But as always, none of that replaces legal advice tailored to your specific circumstances. So as I always say, if you think you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. Feel free to reach out to us and we'd be glad to help. Past episodes can be found on YouTube or on our website and on Facebook. If you like our page or subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get notifications when the episodes are live. And our next episode is going to be on October 18th. We're going to be joined by Eric Yaverbaum, who's the CEO of Erico Communications, for what should be a really fun discussion on Bell Media's handling of the Lisa LaFlamme termination, and more specifically, how not to handle the firing of an employee, especially when you're in the public eye. As always, thanks to Rob, to Rebecca, and Mark for helping put the show together. Thanks, everyone, again for tuning in. We'll see you next time.